Welcome, everyone. This is Coach Collins Bolo, the founder of Family Health, Life Skills, and Career Development. And this is one of our programs in Rebuilding Family Foundation, which comes all the way from Mombasa, Kenya, with an intention of building us, equipping us, and also at the same time educating us. Why is this important, especially in a time like now? Recently in Kenya, the Supreme Court declared one of the presidential candidates to be the president-elect. Different parts of this country, people are seen celebrating because of the tension which was being foreseen, whether the Supreme Court was going to nullify the election or give somebody else to become the president-elect from the one who was declared at the first initial time. So there was tension everywhere. Men and women, even children. And people were praying of different faiths that whatever shall be declared, may peace prevail in our country, Kenya. I'm happy because right now, things are cool. There's no violence. People have accepted the results which have been given, while others are celebrating. We have another group of people who are not celebrating, but mourning. But the right exact word of their emotional experience is what we call grief. It's what we call grief. Interestingly, grief is one of the emotions which is extremely neglected in many societies. Yet the impact of grief, if not solved or resolved, it's extremely detrimental and lethal. And to make the matter worse, many people today are grieving and they're not aware that they're grieving. Probably because nobody's talking about this thing. A group of researchers took several years to do a research on this subject matter of grief. After several investigation and research, they came to find out that we have 43 types of losses which can lead to a state of emotion called grief. 43 types of losses which can lead to an emotional state called grief. But the big question is this: what is grief? How will I know I'm grieving? Is being in a state of grief a pathological problem, a psychological, emotional problem, or it's just a natural reaction to several aspects of life? Today, I'm happy and I'm very glad that we are going to address this subject matter so that after all is said and done, we can be able to learn, and apart from learning, we can learn on how to address our own grief when different issues happen in our life. Now, then the first question is this then: what is grief? Because if you miss the definition, then you won't have the right process towards dealing and or resolving the grief which you might be having at the same time. Now, I want to go systematically, and we are going to have several episodes which we are going to discuss on this subject matter until we can get to understand where we are and what we can do to save ourselves. What is grief? Today I want to deal with the subject matter of dealing with post-election grief and loss in Kenya. Dealing with post-election grief and loss in Kenya, dealing with post-election grief and loss. Now, why is this subject matter extremely important and good? Why do we need to learn about it? Now, that one means we need to first have an accurate answer of what is grief, because if you lose the right definition, you're not going to have the right process towards dealing with grief as an individual. What is grief? Now, grief is normal and natural reaction to significant emotional loss of any kind. Keywords: grief is the normal and natural reaction to significant emotional loss of any kind. Now, there are keywords which you need to pick from at this point. One, it is a normal and natural reaction. So when one is in a grief, it's a reaction which is very normal and very natural. So why is this reaction taking place? Because of a significant emotional loss of any kind. So anytime there is a significant emotional loss of any kind, there's a natural tendency and a natural reaction which a person gets immediately. For example, if you lose your partner, you lose a relationship, you lose probably your phone. Somebody came, strangled you, or someone stole your phone, or even status. There's that feeling, emotional feeling, which immediately gets to you. Now, that feeling, we define it as a normal and natural reaction to significant emotional loss, which can be of any kind. Another definition of grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. It is the conflicting feelings caused by end of or change in as familiar pattern of behavior. So meaning that in a day-to-day life, if there are several familiar patterns of behavior of events happening in your life, then suddenly there's an end of that pattern of behavior or change of that pattern of behavior, which you're so much used to. There's a conflicting feelings which a person gets at that particular point. That conflicting feeling, we call it grief. It's a conflicting feeling because there's an end of a familiar pattern of behavior. So probably in your home, you're so much used. By 6, your husband is coming. By 5, your children are coming home. And once they come, you start uniting as a family. Then a tragedy takes place and they die. So when death happens at this particular point, what happens? That particular pattern of behavior stops and changes, leading to a conflicting kind of a feeling. This also can be similar because you're talking about post-election related grief, whereby we are so much used to certain specific leaders as our heroes when they're in the limelight. The moment the behavior of us seeing them talking, convincing us and impacting us suddenly changes, there's a conflicting feelings which can come at that particular point, and that feeling is called grief. Another definition of grief which might help you to understand: grief is the feeling of reaching out to someone who has always been there, only to find when you need them again, they are no longer there. Grief, it's the feeling of reaching out for someone who has always been there. Just that feeling. of reaching or trying to reach out to someone who has always been there, only to find when you need them again, they are no longer there. It can be a broken relationship. It can be a state of divorce. It can be death, loss of status. Someone has just retired. Or in context of politics, the leader whom you cherish so much and you love listening to him all the time, you suddenly realize you can no longer reach out to this individual. There's an emotional feeling which just gets suddenly drops on you. We call it grief. That's very important to understand. But there's something we need to also acknowledge here. It's a normal and natural reaction. It is not a pathological condition or a personality disorder. Grief, from the definition which I've given to you today, it is not a pathological condition. It's not a disease. It's not an ailment or a personality disorder, as some claim to be, but just a normal and natural reaction which are being caused by several dynamics which get over or in our lives. Now, I believe we are on the same page of defining what grief is. But understanding the definition is not enough. What else do we need to understand which will really help us? Now, this one calls us to come to the point of understanding some of the typical responses, associated with grief. Some of the typical responses associated with grief. What are some of the, when grief takes place, what are some of the typical responses which we see coming out from people because of grief? Now, whenever grief, a loss takes place and someone gets into grief, people react differently. For example, it's something like death, loss of leadership, loss of a leader, loss of a part of a body, loss of a pet. When a loss takes place, out of the 43 different types of losses, when a loss occurs, some of the common typical responses include reduced concentration. There are some people who cannot concentrate on their work at home. They cannot concentrate on their domestic tasks. They cannot concentrate on their studies. They cannot concentrate on their career activity because of the impact of a loss, which has led to grief. Some people, they cannot concentrate and drive, whether in the main highway or our domestic roads. Why? Because of the impact of the loss, which has led to grief. Some, they get to a sense of numbness. Like I know of a person, every year they've been losing a member of a family. And this kind of losses gets to a point whereby people become numb as far as events of life are taking place. This time with the new president-elect who has been chosen, who is going to, in the next 1 week, to be declared to be the next president of Kenya. There are some people in our country, Kenya today, because of every time they believe they win, they're declared losers. They've become numb. The sense of numbness as far as politics is concerned has grown. And some people have had them declaring that they will never vote again. Why? Because they believe there are several irregularities within several processes which makes their votes to be null and void. So one can become numb as far as political issues are concerned. One can become numb as far as loss of relationship is concerned. The people have several historical broken relationships to the point of they've become numb to relate with people anymore. These things do happen in human life. Why? It's one of the typical response which is associated with grief after loss has taken place. Some people get disrupted sleeping patterns. They get disrupted sleeping patterns. They cannot actually sleep well until morning. In the process of sleeping, they have several times where they wake up, they're on and off because of the effect of the loss which has led to grief. Like after the first time when our IEBC chairman declared the president-elect, there are people in the regions where they live, which are hotspot for violence. They have not been having adequate sleep because their leader has lost and they're not sure if they're going to be attacked. These things can happen. Some people, when they get a loss and they get to grief, they change even their eating habits. Some eat extremely too much. Some don't eat well at the same time. Why? Because of the impact and the effect of loss, which has led to grief. We have another category of people who undergo a lot of roller coaster of emotional energy. They're up and down, motivated, demotivated, passionate, not passionate, because of the impact of loss. So this thing people are experiencing right now in Kenya, even as we are just out of election, and other people already experiencing, and they have been experiencing because of other type of losses which they have been incurring in life, leading to grief. And one of the challenging things with grief is the fact that grief in itself, it is very cumulative and negatively cumulative, meaning that every loss you incur, if you don't resolve the loss, every loss you incur, you get to grieve. If you don't resolve your grief, it accumulates. So issues start accumulating and accumulating to the point whereby from just a small anthill, it can become a huge mountain within the part of a psycho-emotional part of you. Now, the other people who are experiencing now, due to that, then it becomes important for us to understand different number of losses considered as grief. Not every loss is considered to be grief, but there are some type of losses which can be considered to be grief. And it's important for us to understand. Now, from the research that was done after several number of years, around 15 years, it has been found out that there are over 43 losses that are considered to be grief. Some example includes death. It's one of the loss which can lead to grief. A loved one, a colleague, a neighbor, a friend, your acquaintance, an associate, a business partner, when they die at this particular point, then the natural reaction which comes because your friend has just died because of death is a feeling of grief. Divorce. Somebody you loved each other, you're calling each other at one point of time, babe, honey, my dear, my lovely one, the sweet one. Then things happen to the point whereby you can no longer resolve your problem and your challenges and your differences. Then you get to the point whereby you have to divorce. When divorce takes place, it's a loss of relationship, which leads also to grief. Some of the listed, and we'll be seeing how dangerous divorce is as far as human life is concerned. Retirement is a loss for some people, leading to grief. Moving to new places is a loss for some people, leading to grief. Pet loss. People used to say in the past that Africans don't feel it, but the truth is they do feel. When your dog dies, you feel it even in Africa. It doesn't matter. Loss of a pet can lead to grief. Financial challenges can lead to grief. Either it increases or decreases in wealth. It can actually lead to grief. Loss of health. You're once extremely healthy and well, then suddenly something happens, you just start deteriorating, you lose your health, you're no longer in control of your health because you have cancer, you're diabetic now, you have developed arthritis. But the feeling of grief also comes during this particular moment and time. Legal problems, one case after the other, debts, becoming bankrupt can lead to grief. Emptiness state. Your children whom you are very happy about, you are so proud about, you are identifying yourself with them, suddenly they have all grown and they have left your home to go and expand their kingdom domain as a family. And you remain as two. That feeling of emptiness it can lead to a state of grief. Also, end of addiction for many. Because it's a pattern of taking drugs to keep yourself high. The moment it comes to an end, the feeling of grief also comes to the addict. And also starting school for your children, a new school can lead to grief? Yes, how? Because every time you transfer your children to new school and they disconnect with the friends that developed in their former school, they feel the state of grief because they have lost their friends in their former school, and now they have to start afresh to build new relationships where they are. These are just 9 out of the 43 type of losses which one can incur. The other intangible example of grief, which also I'd like you to know, for example, like loss of trust. You have been working with this boss, you have worked together for many years, and suddenly something happens, someone comes between you, an event happens, maybe of loss of resources, loss of money takes place, then suddenly loss of trust peaks in for one against the other. Now, during the time of election, how many people have lost trust to our election body? How many people have lost trust to their political leaders? How many people have lost trust to the government? So loss of trust is one of the intangible examples of grief which people experience in their day-to-day life. Loss of safety. Who shall I trust? Am I safe in the hands of the police? Am I safe in the hands of the government? Am I safe in the hands of my neighbor? Am I safe in the hands of my uncle, my aunt? Loss of safety leads to grief. We talk about issues like loss of control, whereby you have a boss, whereby you exist to be seen and to follow orders, but you cannot contribute your ideas. Whereby a time like now, as much as you did all your voting, but you have no control over what shall be declared to be, or who shall be declared to become a winner. It leads to grief. Loss of faith. Who shall we trust? Who shall we believe in? And some people get to a point of loss of faith in God because things happening around them, they are too much heavy that they cannot bear. And they call upon the name of God and doesn't come in. They lose faith in God. It can lead to grief. We are talking about loss of productivity, whereby you have been known to be one of the most productive staff, and every time you produce, the company pushes the goalpost. It pushes the goalpost until it gets to the point whereby you can never reach the goalpost and your productivity is declared null and void. It leads to a state of feeling of grief. These are real things which happen in our day-to-day life. So what should we do as these things bombard us day after day? That one should help us to ask ourselves this question. When these losses take place and we have grief, do people have the same experience as far as grief is concerned? You have 10 people, all of them, their husbands have died or their wives have died. Do they all experience the same thing? Now, one thing to understand is this, a point to note. Just like today, one person has been declared to be the next president-elect, and so many people are celebrating, and so many people are in grief. But even among the people who are in grief, do they experience the same level of grief? The answer is this: grief is individual and unique. I repeat again, grief is individual and unique. People don't have the same experience even when one common event takes place within the same environment. Why? Because it's individual and it is unique. And there's nothing like stages in grief, because grief cannot neatly be categorized. And in most of our college, most of our university, people have been taught about stages of grief, which were developed by Elizabeth Kubler. But the reality is this: Elizabeth Kubler-Ross work was on death and the dying. He did a research on death and the dying, not people in grief. And she came up with several stages, which when someone is dying, it passes through, like denial, the stage of anger, the stage of acceptance. All these stages were based on research on death and the dying, but not grief. Unfortunately, as much as she was very specific, even in her book about the kind of research she was doing, today so many institutions have taken the stages of death and dying and have infiltrated it to what grief is, which is not correct. It is going in contrast to the intention of the researcher or the author of the research. Now, this common information has confused and hurt many grievers throughout the year. Why have many grievers been hurt? Because every time they go for therapy, they've been taken through stages, yet this thing is unique and very individual. And there's nothing like stages in grief. This is something you need to understand, and it's a point which you need to note, which is very important. Now, because of that, what can we say? Sadly, if you misdiagnose, you also mistreat. So that's mean, because so many grievers have been misdiagnosed, then by the end of the day, they have been mistreated by professionals. Now, these mislabeled grievers are then incorrectly put under various medications, which will get into the way of recovering. Now, which will get into the way of recovering from loss. Now, this is somebody who is in grief because he lost a husband, wife, or a child, or lost a job. Then it's misdiagnosed. So in this griever is undergoing a lot of emotional difficulties and challenges, psychological, emotional, psychosocial. What happens? It gets misdiagnosed. The therapist is not aware this occurrence is happening on this individual because of grief. Then immediately is put under a lot of different type of medication, which damages the griever by the end of the day. How many grievers do you know today? They've been so hurt and they've been put into so many medications, psychotic medications, because the therapist never knew this person, after the husband died, started undergoing grief, experiencing grief. And what he needed was grief therapy, but not psychotic and other medical medication. This is how unique and challenging this matter is. That's why the other second episode, third episode, fourth episode, don't miss it, because I'll be addressing on how to handle this issue of grief. In our next episode, I'll talk about how do I know if I or someone I know is incomplete with a loss? How do I know or someone I know is incomplete with a loss? People are undergoing a lot. We need to understand ourselves. We need to understand people around us to be able to know if they are undergoing this challenge, so that by the end of the day, we can be of great help, we can be of great support, we can be the great right hand for ourselves and people around us. And by the end of the day, as we do that, we are going to be celebrated because of the impact and support which you can give. Make sure you will not miss the next episode as we continue all the way from Mombasa with family health, life skills, and career development. God bless you so much. Let's connect again in our next episode. Good night, good day, good morning from any part of the world. Today, you can listen to me, you can learn from me. God bless you.
Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of cares and bids me at my Father's throne, make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief and oft escaped the tempter's snare by thy return, sweet hour of prayer. Gua yoye kunamata nahi yota by thy return, sweet hour.